The Voice in the Dark. The sound of the rain tapping against the window pane was his only company. In his small, dim apartment, he sat at his desk, fingers tracing over the dots of braille on a sheet that had just been delivered. The courier had left it without a word, like always. No sender, no explanation, just the faint scent of mildew and something coppery, like blood, clinging to the paper. Elijah Greaves didn't ask questions. He never had. Questions had never served him well, not in the blind school where he was the outcast, not in the foster homes that had treated him like a piece of defective furniture, and certainly not on the streets, where he learned the world had little patience for a man who couldn't see. He lost his sight when he was 7. One morning, he woke to darkness and a searing pain that no doctor could explain. His mother, a tired woman whose face he could only faintly remember, had wept for a day before abandoning him at the county hospital. She had promised to return, but never did. After that, it was one abusive home after another, each more callous than the last. Elijah's world became a series of unfamiliar rooms filled with strangers' voices, slamming doors, and hands that were too rough. The memory of those homes haunted him, but he had found ways to endure. He grew used to navigating the world with his other senses, counting steps, memorizing the slight changes in sound and smell that signaled doorways, curbs, or alleyways. He learned to make himself invisible, keeping his head down, never attracting attention. Now, at 32, he lived in a world of shapes defined by touch, sound, and intuition, never by sight. The Braille translations had started 6 months ago, a bizarre but lucrative offer that had appeared when he was at his lowest. Out of work, barely scraping by, and hounded by a landlord who was as unforgiving as the world that had abandoned him, Elijah received an email with a proposition. The message was brief and cryptic. "We have work for those with unique skills, generous compensation, no questions asked." There was no signature, no name, just an attached bank account that grew with each job completed. The work itself was strange, texts filled with archaic language, symbols that made no sense, and instructions that seemed more like incantations than any coherent narrative. But Elijah didn't care. The money was real, and it kept the lights on, even if he couldn't see them. Today's text felt different. His fingertips moved slowly across the page, pausing at each line, as if his body sensed something his mind couldn't yet comprehend. The words were familiar, yet alien, pulling at the edges of his memory. There were phrases about fire and shadows, about gates that should never be opened and names that should never be spoken. Elijah's heart quickened. He could feel the pulse of something dark, something alive, in the dots under his fingertips. The faint hum of his space heater, the distant sounds of the city outside, and the relentless ticking of his clock all seemed to fade into the background, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed against his skull. For the first time since he'd started, he felt a tremor of doubt. The texts had always been unsettling, but this one was different. It was as if the Braille itself was breathing, exhaling secrets he wasn't meant to know. Yet, he continued, compelled by a force he couldn't name. The last line stopped him cold. It was a command, simple and direct. "Speak it aloud, and the way shall be opened." Elijah's throat tightened. He didn't know what the words meant, but they filled him with a dread that clung to his bones. He pushed his chair back, his fingers leaving the page as if burned. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in, and the rain outside had turned to a torrential downpour that drowned out all other noise. He sat in the dark, breathing heavily. The promise of sight, buried deep within his memories, flickered like a cruel joke. He remembered the color of the sky before it all went black, the way his mother's hair had shone in the sunlight. He would have given anything to see again, to break free from the constant smothering night that was his life. But something in that text made him hesitate. He wasn't just reading these words, he was inviting something in. Elijah tried to shake off the feeling that clung to him, but the words remained, echoing in the corners of his mind. He turned on the small tape recorder he used for his translations, a cheap, worn device with buttons smoothed from years of use. It had been his voice, his connection to the outside world, for as long as he could remember. "Job number 7, he said, his voice flat and hollow. "Received August 17th. Translation in progress." The sound of his own voice calmed him. grounding him in the familiar. He focused on the task, translating the Braille into spoken words, careful to capture every nuance. The phrases were sharp, guttural, full of harsh consonants and strange, elongated syllables. It was like speaking a language that wasn't meant for human tongues. The words tasted bitter, leaving his mouth dry and his heart uneasy. As he read, something shifted. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence that made his skin prickle. The text flowed faster now, his voice rising and falling with an unsettling cadence that felt more like a chant than a translation. He could sense the words crawling out into the darkness, writhing like snakes. Elijah stopped, his breath ragged. The room was silent again, but the silence felt different, charged, electric, as if the walls were listening. He reached for his cup of water, knocking it over. The cold splash against his hand startled him, breaking the spell, and he cursed under his breath. "Get a grip," he muttered, wiping his hand on his shirt. But the words on the page still lingered, daring him to continue. He shut off the recorder and set the Braille page aside, unwilling to touch it again. Elijah fumbled for his phone, calling the only contact he had associated with the job, a voicemail line that never picked up, only played a robotic message asking for progress updates. He dialed the number anyway, listening to the familiar tone, hoping for some kind of reassurance. Instead, he was met with static. It was faint at first, then grew louder, buzzing in his ear like a swarm of angry insects. Elijah pulled the phone away, but the sound persisted, now seeping into the room around him. It was the sound of whispers, dozens of voices speaking all at once, too soft to understand, but too loud to ignore. His blood ran cold. He threw the phone down, but the whispers didn't stop. They were inside his head, an invasive presence that gnawed at his sanity. Elijah squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his palms to his ears, trying to block them out, but they only grew stronger. Fragments of his past resurfaced, the sound of his mother's voice, brittle and frail, the screech of an iron gate at a group home, the taunts of other kids who had called him useless, a burden. He stumbled back, hitting the wall, his breath coming in panicked bursts. The whispers suddenly ceased, plunging the room into an oppressive silence. Elijah's fingers trembled as he reached out, touching the cold plaster, grounding himself. The panic ebbed, but a chill remained, burrowing deep into his core. Elijah had always felt alone, but this was different. This was the kind of alone that made you doubt your own existence, as if the darkness could swallow you whole and no one would notice. He didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant car horn felt like a threat. The next day, the courier returned with another package, the same plain envelope with the faint, rotten smell. Elijah's first instinct was to throw it away, but his hands moved on their own, tearing it open and running his fingers over the dots. This time, the words were more urgent, more demanding. They spoke of a bargain, of a gate that could be opened if only the right price was paid. It was written like a plea, begging to be read aloud. Elijah's stomach churned. He felt like he was holding something dangerous, something alive. As the days passed, the texts became a sick obsession. He would sit at his desk, reading and translating, his voice low and strained. The Braille pages seemed to pulse beneath his fingertips, vibrating with a sinister energy. He no longer recorded his translations. He simply read, as if compelled by some unseen force. Elijah tried to reach out, calling every number, sending emails to dead ends. No one ever responded. The money kept coming, deposited in his account like clockwork, but the work felt like a trap closing around him. He began to dream of a towering figure, faceless and cloaked in shadow, always just out of reach. The figure would whisper to him in a language he couldn't understand, promising things that filled him with equal parts longing and dread. One night, as he sat alone with yet another page, the whispers returned. This time, they spoke clearly. "Open your eyes," they said, and Elijah's breath hitched. He reached out, his hand shaking as he touched the words. "You can see her again?" The voice was soft, feminine, so much like his mother's that it made his heart ache. Elijah's vision was filled with a memory of sunlight filtering through a window, of his mother's smile before the world went dark. Tears welled up, and he pressed his hands to his eyes, wishing for even a sliver of that light. Finish the reading. Open the way. Elijah pulled back, horrified. He slammed the page shut, ripping it from the desk and tossing it across the room. The whispers faded, but the promise remained, echoing through the silence. For the first time in years, he felt afraid of what he might see. Days passed in a blur of sleepless nights and anxious pacing. Elijah's apartment felt more like a tomb, each shadow hiding something he couldn't see, but could feel, watching him. The Braille pages piled up, each one more unnerving than the last, but he couldn't bring himself to stop reading. It was as if the words had a hold on him, drawing him deeper into a darkness he couldn't escape. The money continued to flow into his account, but Elijah barely noticed it anymore. He was consumed by the texts, strange, feverish nightmares that felt like messages from another world. He dreamed of gates opening in vast, starless voids, and of monstrous shapes writhing in the darkness, waiting to be released. He would wake up gasping, the phantom images lingering behind his closed eyes. One morning, Elijah woke to find his phone ringing, an unfamiliar number. He hesitated, his heart pounding, and answered. Elijah Greaves? The voice on the other end was smooth, almost melodic, with an undercurrent of something unsettling. Yes, who is this? Elijah's voice cracked, his throat dry. We are pleased with your progress, Mr. Greaves, the voice continued. You have done well. The final text will be delivered today. Complete it, and your reward will be beyond imagining. Elijah tried to ask who they were, but the line went dead. He stood there, phone in hand, feeling more isolated than ever. The final text. What did that mean? He had always assumed there was no end to this work, that he was just a cog in some strange, faceless machine. But now, it felt like he was on the brink of something irrevocable, a decision that could not be undone. The courier arrived that afternoon, slipping the envelope under the door without a sound. Elijah picked it up, feeling the familiar cold dread wash over him. He sat at his desk, tracing the Braille with trembling fingers. The text was short, just a few lines, but every word felt heavy, charged with a power that made his skin crawl. Speak the final passage, and the way shall be opened. You will be granted sight beyond sight, a gift for the faithful. Elijah's hands shook. He wanted to rip the page in half, to throw it away and never look at it again, but the promise was too strong. Sight. After all these years of darkness, all the pain, the anger, the loneliness, he could see again. His mind raced with possibilities. He could walk down the street without counting steps, see the faces of the people who passed him by, look at the sky and know its color. He could see his mother's face, not just the faint, distorted image his memory clung to, but the real thing, alive and vivid. Elijah knew he should stop, that something about this was horribly wrong, but he couldn't bring himself to turn away. He cleared his throat, his voice wavering as he began to speak the words aloud. The air around him grew thick, stifling, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Each syllable felt like a stone dropped into a deep well, rippling outward into unseen depths. As he finished the last line, the temperature plummeted, and a strange wind whipped through the room, rattling the windows and sending papers flying. Elijah staggered back, his head spinning. The whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices that filled his ears and drowned out all other sound. He pressed his hands to his ears, but it was useless. The voices were inside him, pulling at his mind like hooks. The shadows in the room twisted, coalescing into a shape that defied understanding. It was a mass of darkness, shifting and writhing, vaguely humanoid but constantly changing, as if it couldn't decide what form to take. Elijah could feel its presence, towering over him, ancient and malevolent. The whispers fell silent, replaced by a single, resonant voice that filled the room. You have called me forth, Elijah Greaves. Elijah's breath caught in his throat. The voice was everywhere, surrounding him, vibrating through his bones. It was deep, echoing like 1,000 voices speaking in unison. You have done well, servant. You have opened the way. What? What are you? Elijah's voice was barely a whisper, trembling with fear. I am known by many names, the figure said, its form shifting like smoke. But to you, I am your liberator, your guide. You have summoned me, and now I offer you a choice. The darkness moved closer, its edges fraying and reforming like tendrils of smoke. Elijah could feel a heat emanating from it, scorching and oppressive. He stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. What choice? He managed, his voice cracking. The gift of sight, the figure said, its tone almost seductive. To see all that was taken from you, to witness the world with eyes unclouded, to gaze upon the sun, the stars, the faces of those you have lost. Elijah's heart ached at the words. He could see his mother again, the way she was before she left him, whole, beautiful, smiling. But even as the desire clawed at him, a deep-seated fear gripped his soul. What's the cost? Elijah asked, his voice barely holding steady. The figure laughed, a sound that resonated like the tolling of a distant bell. Nothing you were not willing to give. Your soul, Elijah, your essence. A fair trade, would you not agree? Elijah's mind raced. He had always dreamed of seeing again, of escaping the darkness that had been his prison since childhood. But the cost, the thought of giving up his soul, of becoming something else, twisted his gut with a primal terror. He remembered the abuse, the homes that had tried to break him, the endless nights spent alone, wishing for something better. Now the offer was there, a chance to be whole again, to see the light, to be free of the shadows that had haunted him for so long. But it came at a price he wasn't sure he could pay. You don't have to decide now, the figure said, its voice softer, almost gentle. But know this, the door is open. The choice is yours. With that, the figure dissolved, the shadows dissipating into nothing. The room returned to its previous state, the oppressive weight lifting but leaving behind a profound emptiness. Elijah sat in the darkness, his mind reeling. The offer hung in the air, a promise and a threat. He was alone again, but the choice loomed over him, impossible to ignore. Elijah sat for what felt like hours, his mind looping over the demon's words. The room around him was still, but his thoughts were a storm. He tried to think rationally, to weigh the offer like it was a simple transaction, but nothing about this felt rational. His chest tightened with each passing minute, the memory of the darkness lingering like smoke. He stood up, feeling his way around the apartment, his fingers brushing over familiar surfaces, his threadbare couch, the chipped edge of the kitchen counter, the framed photo of his mother he couldn't see but knew by touch. Each object was a lifeline, a reminder of the world he inhabited but could never fully experience. Elijah traced the outline of the photo, feeling the ridges of the frame. The image inside was old, worn from years of handling. He'd touched it so many times, trying to memorize the contours of the face he'd never truly seen. His mother had been everything to him, the one bright spot in a childhood marred by pain. Even now he could hear her voice in his mind, a soft, soothing melody that had kept him company through the darkest moments. But then she was gone, and the world turned cold. Elijah had been passed from one foster home to another, each more hostile than the last. He'd been the blind kid, the burden no one wanted, an easy target for cruelty. He remembered the sting of fists, the taunts of other children, and the endless nights spent hiding under thin, scratchy blankets, wishing he could disappear. The thought of sight had been his one comfort, a distant dream that seemed forever out of reach. Now that dream was within grasp, and all he had to do was say yes. Elijah sank onto the couch, his hands trembling. The demon's words echoed in his ears, to see all that was taken from you. It was the kind of promise that felt like a lifeline, dangling just out of reach. But Elijah knew better than to trust it fully. There had to be more to the price than just his soul. The days dragged on, each one more agonizing than the last. Elijah couldn't bring himself to read the texts, but he couldn't throw them away either. They sat on his desk, a silent reminder of the decision that loomed over him. He barely ate, barely slept. The shadows in his apartment seemed to grow thicker, creeping along the walls like living things. Then, one night, the nightmares returned. Elijah found himself standing in a vast, empty space, surrounded by darkness that pressed in on all sides. There was no sound, no light, only the suffocating weight of nothingness. He reached out, but his hands found nothing. The ground beneath his feet was cold and unyielding, like stone. In the distance, a figure appeared, faint and wavering like a mirage. Elijah squinted, trying to make out its shape, but it was elusive, always just beyond his grasp. As it drew closer, he realized it was his mother. She looked as she had in his earliest memories, young, vibrant, her hair flowing like a dark river. She reached out to him, her smile sad and tender. "Elijah," she whispered, her voice echoing through the void. "My sweet boy." Elijah's heart ached. He took a step forward, then another, desperate to close the distance between them. But the ground gave way beneath him, and he was falling, tumbling through endless blackness. He reached out, but his mother's figure was fading, swallowed by the shadows. He woke with a start, drenched in sweat, his pulse racing. The apartment was quiet, but the dream lingered, a vivid reminder of what he could never have. Elijah sat up, clutching his head. He couldn't keep living like this, caught between a promise and a nightmare. The next day, Elijah made a decision. He picked up the final Braille page, feeling the familiar patterns beneath his fingers. He would finish it, one last time. He needed to know what was on the other side, even if it meant facing whatever awaited him. With shaking hands, he began to read. The words spilled out, harsh and guttural, filled with dark invocations and twisted promises. They felt heavier this time, each one dragging him deeper into the darkness. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the shadows around him began to shift, coalescing into the familiar shape of the demon. Elijah kept reading, his voice rising and falling in a strange rhythmic chant. The demon's form solidified, its presence filling the room with a suffocating heat. Elijah's breath came in ragged gasps, but he didn't stop. He could feel the power in the words, pulling him forward, pushing him to the brink. As he reached the final line, the demon stepped closer, towering over him like a living shadow. Its voice boomed, resonant and commanding. "You have done well, Elijah Greaves. The gate is open. The choice is yours." Elijah stared into the darkness where he imagined the demon's eyes would be. He felt small, insignificant, like a child lost in a storm. But beneath the fear there was something else, anger, defiance. He had been used his entire life, shuffled from one uncaring home to another, always at the mercy of others. Now, he was being offered something he had dreamed of, but at a cost that would erase the very essence of who he was. "What happens if I refuse?" Elijah asked, his voice hoarse. The demon's form rippled, its features distorting. "Then you remain as you are, blind and broken. You will live out your days in darkness, haunted by what could have been. But should you accept, you will see the world anew, whole and unblemished." Elijah thought of his mother, of the fleeting moments of warmth and safety she had given him. He thought of the years spent in darkness, the countless faces he would never know. But he also thought of his soul, of the part of him that had survived every hardship, every loss. To give that up was to surrender everything he had fought to hold on to. Elijah clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. "No," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I won't do it. I won't give you my soul." The demon's form flared, a surge of heat and fury that sent a shockwave through the room. Elijah braced himself, expecting pain, fire, some horrific retribution. But instead, the demon laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that made Elijah's skin crawl. "So be it, blind one," it said, its voice dripping with contempt. "But know this, the door remains open. The offer stands. You will come to me in time." With that, the demon vanished, leaving the room cold and empty. Elijah collapsed onto the floor, his heart racing, his body trembling. He had refused, but the fear lingered. The demon's words hung over him like a curse, a promise that would never be broken. Elijah lay there, alone in the dark. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of something he thought he'd lost. A choice, no matter how fragile, was still his to make. room remained cold and silent, the echo of the demon's laughter fading into the oppressive stillness. Elijah lay on the floor, the weight of his decision pressing heavily on him. He could feel the chill seeping into his bones, a stark reminder of the choice he had made. The darkness was no longer just a physical absence of light, but a profound, existential void. He slowly got to his feet, his body aching from the cold and the tension. His mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts, relief mingled with lingering dread. He moved towards the desk, feeling for the scattered braille pages. The final text lay among them, a reminder of the promise he had rejected. Elijah picked up the pages, his fingers brushing over the dots. The tactile sensation was strangely comforting, grounding him in the present, even as he felt the shadows of his decision looming over him. He considered destroying the texts, erasing any trace of the deal, but a part of him held back. What if the demon was right? What if he had missed his chance at redemption? The silence was broken by the faint sound of a phone ringing. Elijah hesitated, then reached for the receiver. The same number flashed on the screen, a familiar cold feeling settling in his chest. He answered, his voice strained. "Hello?" There was no response, only the sound of heavy breathing and a faint, distant hum. Elijah's grip tightened around the phone, his heart pounding. The line went dead again, leaving him with a lingering sense of unease. He tried to focus on his surroundings, to remind himself that he had made his choice. But the apartment felt different now, larger, emptier, as if the walls were closing in. The darkness seemed to pulse, a living presence that was both familiar and foreign. As he stood there, his senses heightened, Elijah felt the air around him shift. It was as if the very atmosphere was alive, responding to an unseen force. The whispers returned, softer this time, almost like a gentle breeze. They were not the harsh, chaotic voices of before, but a soothing murmur that carried an air of melancholy. "Elijah," the voices whispered. "Elijah, can you hear us?" He strained to listen, but the words were indistinct, fading in and out like a distant radio signal. The whispers seemed to swirl around him, a soft, mournful chorus that tugged at the edges of his perception. He closed his eyes, trying to shut out the sound, but it was no use. The whispers grew louder, filling his mind with a cacophony of fragmented thoughts and emotions. He could almost make out a pattern, a rhythm to the voices, but it remained elusive. Elijah opened his eyes and saw nothing but darkness. The room seemed to stretch out before him, an endless expanse of shadow. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but the air felt thick and charged, as if something was about to happen. He moved towards the window, feeling for the latch, and pushed it open. The cool night air hit his face, a stark contrast to the stifling heat inside. He leaned out, his heart racing, hoping for a sign, a glimpse of the world beyond. But all he saw was the void, the same dark, starless sky that had been there before. The night was unbroken, an endless expanse of blackness that stretched out as far as the eye could see. The world outside was as empty and silent as the one within. Elijah stepped back, closing the window with a soft click. He turned back to the room, feeling a strange sense of déjà vu. The shadows seemed to writhe, shifting in the corners of his vision. He was alone, but the presence of something unseen lingered, a silent witness to his choice. The final text lay on the desk, a reminder of the offer he had refused. Elijah reached out, touching it one last time, feeling the familiar braille patterns beneath his fingers. The promise of sight, of redemption, was still there, hovering just out of reach. He wondered if he would ever truly be free of the shadows, if the darkness would always follow him, no matter where he went. The demon's words echoed in his mind, a haunting reminder of what could have been. Elijah stood there, caught between hope and despair, between the promise of light and the reality of his darkness. The choice was made, but the consequences remained uncertain. The whispers faded, leaving only the silence, and Elijah was left alone with his thoughts, the ambiguity of his future stretching out before him. As he sat in the dim light of his apartment, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, waiting. The darkness had not been vanquished, nor had the promise of sight been fully extinguished. It lingered, a shadow that would follow him into the unknown, a reminder of the choice he had made and the path he had yet to walk. In the end, Elijah's decision was his alone, but the consequences were shrouded in mystery. The future was uncertain, a landscape of shadows and whispers, and the darkness remained, a constant companion in a world where sight and blindness were intertwined.